In just 92 seconds on live national television, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett shattered decades of silence and put the Chief Justice of the United States on the defensive. Millions watched in outrage as she exposed a hidden trail of power, money, and betrayal that could change American democracy forever. This isn't just politics. It's a fight for the very right to vote. The question is, if you stood in her place, would you risk everything to tell the truth? The air outside the Capitol was still heavy, with the remnants of night, a faint mist clinging to the marble steps, like a warning no one could read. Jasmine Crockett climbed them alone, her heels striking a rhythm that seemed to echo through the hollow morning. In politics, dawn can be the most dangerous time, and she knew it. The city was quiet, but inside those walls, battles were already being planned, and some of them had her name written in red. She pushed open the heavy door, the smell of polished wood and cold stone rushing toward her. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket, but she ignored it. Today was not for distractions. She was here with a purpose that had been building for months, a slow fire that had turned into a storm she could no longer hold back. Jasmine was not just another voice in the chamber. She was a fighter for people who never had a seat at the table, and the table's keepers knew it. Out in the neighborhoods she represented, the sun would just be breaking over brick apartment blocks and narrow streets lined with corner stores. She had walked those streets 100 times, shaking hands at voter registration drives, where college students sat behind folding tables with clipboards and stacks of forms. She had stood in community kitchens, where the air was thick with the smell of simmering stew and exhaustion, speaking to mothers who worked 2 jobs yet still feared the rent bill. In cramped legal aid offices, she had sat beside immigrants, clutching folders full of documents. They barely understood their faces caught between hope and fear. Those were the people she carried with her into every room, even this one. As she moved through the hallway, portraits of past leaders stared down from the walls, their eyes like locked doors. She wondered how many of them had ever truly listened to the voices beyond the marble. The quiet hum of early staffers filled the air, shuffling papers, murmuring in corners. There was a tension here, the kind that comes when everyone senses something is about to break. Jasmine could feel it pressing in on her like a storm front. She reached her office and unlocked the door, stepping into the dim light. On her desk, a thick envelope waited, placed there before she arrived. No name, no return address. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it, the edges crisp against her fingers. For a moment, she considered leaving it sealed, but the fire in her chest pushed her forward. Inside, a handful of documents slid out, their top pages marked with court letterhead and the faint watermark of the highest bench in the land. Her eyes caught on a single phrase highlighted in yellow. It made her stomach tighten. The words spoke of decisions not yet public, of strategies designed to reshape voting laws in states where every ballot could tip the balance. And there, in the careful language of legal correspondence, she saw the signature she had imagined but hoped not to find. John Roberts. The most guarded man in the judicial world had left a fingerprint, and now it was in her hands. She sat back in her chair, the envelope lying open like a wound. Somewhere outside, the city was waking, but here the air had thickened. Every instinct told her this was bigger than anything she had touched before, and that touching it might burn her career to the ground. She stared at the documents again, tracing the lines with her eyes, imagining the lives they could change. She thought of the single mother who told, her voice trembling, that she had been turned away from the polls for the first time in 20 years. She thought of the college student whose registration mysteriously disappeared days before the election. She thought of the immigrant who believed in the promise of a system that had already decided to close its doors. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she picked it up. A message from a trusted aide appeared on the screen, short and urgent. "We need to talk. It's about Roberts." She glanced at the envelope again, the weight of its contents anchoring her to the chair. This was no longer just another day in Washington. This was the start of something that could shatter reputations, test loyalties, and drag truths into the light that some would fight to keep buried. If you have ever felt like the system was deaf to your voice, imagine standing here now holding proof that it was not just deaf, but deliberately silencing you. What would you do next? The documents still lay open on her desk when the sharp chime of her phone cut through the silence. Jasmine glanced at the screen, expecting another message from her aide, but instead a bright red banner scrolled across the news app. Supreme Court narrows federal oversight on state voting laws. She tapped it, and the headline expanded, each word settling on her like a weight. The opinion was written with surgical precision, couched in legal language that sounded neutral but hid the blunt reality. Without federal oversight, states with long histories of voter suppression would have new freedom to change rules, redraw districts, and close polling stations with little fear of being challenged. And at the center of it, the signature she had seen before was there again. Chief Justice John Roberts. She did not have to imagine the consequences. She had seen them before in the eyes of her constituents. She knew which neighborhoods would lose polling sites first. She knew which voters would face new ID requirements that seemed designed to fail them. The decision was not abstract to her. It would shape the lives of thousands she had sworn to protect. She closed the article, set her phone down, and stared at the thin shaft of light cutting through the blinds. Somewhere outside, reporters were already gathering sound bites, building narratives. Soon the story would not be about the ruling. It would be about the reaction. By the time she stepped into the small studio for her scheduled interview, the ruling was all anyone wanted to talk about. The host smiled thinly as the cameras rolled, reading the headline aloud for the audience. Jasmine kept her hands folded in her lap, forcing herself to breathe evenly. She knew the words she chose here would travel far beyond this room. When the host asked her first question, she leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "This is not just policy," she said. "This is people's lives." It was not rehearsed. It was not for effect. It was the truth as she had lived it, and the truth as she would fight for it. In living rooms across her district, the interview flickered on screens. In a community kitchen, volunteers paused their work to watch their hands still holding ladles and cutting boards. In a cramped apartment, an elderly man who had voted in every election for 50 years turned up the volume. In a college dorm, a young woman glanced at her voter registration card and wondered if it would still be valid next year. The ruling was more than a headline to them. It was a shift in the ground beneath their feet. Hope dimmed in the space of a few sentences, replaced by a quiet confusion that often came before anger. As the interview ended, Jasmine stepped outside into the hallway, the light still burning in her mind. Her aide was waiting, a phone in hand, showing her the flood of messages already pouring in. Constituents wanted answers. Activists were calling for action. Reporters wanted quotes. She looked at the screen, then at the aide, and nodded once. The decision was final in the court, but not in the court of public will. She could feel the storm building, and she knew she had a choice to make. If you were in her position now, with the weight of your community on your shoulders and proof that the highest court had shifted the rules against them, what would be your first move? The hallway outside the interview studio smelled faintly of coffee and freshly printed paper, but there was a heavier scent beneath it, something she had learned to recognize over her years in Washington. It was the weight of conversations that had already happened, decisions already made, and doors already closed before the public even knew there was a question. Jasmine's aide fell into step beside her, their voice low. "Someone left this for you," they said, handing her a slim folder sealed in plain manila. There was no label, no note, just the faint crease of having been carried in a jacket pocket. She waited until she was back in her office before breaking the seal. Inside were 4 pages each, stamped with the faint watermark of a judicial chamber. The first page was a meeting schedule, neat columns of dates and times, but the locations caught her eye immediately. None of them were official court venues. Instead, they were private clubs, secluded estates, and an unlisted address in Virginia she recognized only because it had once surfaced in a donor investigation years ago. The names beside each date were more telling still. They were not fellow justices or legal scholars. They were political donors with deep ties to industries that benefited from restrictive voting laws. She flipped to the next page. It was a summary of discussion points from one of those private meetings. The language was careful, polished, and deliberately vague, but between the lines it was impossible to miss the meaning. Talk of maintaining electoral integrity paired with state autonomy had long been coded language for tightening control over who could cast a ballot. The phrasing was almost identical to the arguments Roberts had used in recent opinions. The final 2 pages were lists, one of confirmed attendees at a dinner, the other of interested parties for future discussions. She traced her finger down the list, stopping at a name she had seen in campaign finance reports of more than one senator. A pulse began to thud at the base of her skull. These were not casual gatherings or ceremonial dinners. They were strategy sessions shielded from the public under the guise of private social events. And if the Chief Justice of the United States was sitting at those tables, then the line between impartial law and political engineering had blurred beyond recognition. She thought back to the ruling that morning, the language crafted so carefully it seemed untouchable. Now with these pages in front of her, the shape of the truth began to emerge. She leaned back in her chair, the faint creak of leather, the only sound in the room. Through the blinds, the white dome of the Capitol was framed against a sky that had shifted from pale blue to the washed-out gray of an overcast afternoon. The marble halls that connected the branches of government seemed suddenly less like monuments and more like corridors where shadows moved without witness. She wondered how many such meetings had happened, how many decisions had been shaped in the low light of private rooms rather than in the transparency the law demanded. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from a journalist she trusted asking cryptically if she had seen the donor connection yet. She typed back a non-committal reply, unwilling to tip her hand before she understood just how deep this went. The folder lay open on her desk, the pages shifting slightly in the air from the vent above, like they were restless to be read by someone else. She thought of the people outside these walls who would never know the names on this list, who would never see how the gears turned in places they were not allowed to enter. She thought of the next election cycle, of the subtle changes to voting laws that would pass quietly under the cover of bureaucratic language. She thought of how trust in the system eroded, not with a bang, but with a slow, deliberate turning of screws behind closed doors. Her aide stepped in, asking if she wanted to lock the folder away. She shook her head. Not yet. There was something about the pages, the way the dates and names lined up so neatly, that made her certain this was only a fragment of a larger picture. The real story was still hidden, waiting to be pieced together. And if these were the first seeds of suspicion, they were already finding purchase in her mind. She gathered the pages back into the folder, her fingers pausing on the top one. Her eyes lingered on the signature block, where the initials JGR were scrawled in a hand she had seen before. Her jaw tightened, and she let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Leaning forward, she placed the folder flat on the desk and whispered into the empty room, her voice low enough to be swallowed by the air. So this is how they do it. The folder had not left her desk since she first opened it. Every time she passed by, her eyes caught the faint scrawl of initials, the careful arrangement of dates and names, and it pulled her back into the gravity of what it meant. By the third morning, the decision had settled in her mind like a weight she could no longer shift. She was not going to bury it in a locked drawer. She was not going to pass it off to someone else. If this was a risk, she would carry it herself. The chamber floor was waiting, and she knew what she was about to do would ripple far beyond its walls. When she entered the House chamber, the air was already thick with the usual undercurrent of anticipation and low conversation. The buzz of staffers and aides moving between seats was the background music of the place, but today, even before she spoke, there was a subtle shift in tone. Some faces glanced her way, and then away again, as if they already suspected she was carrying something more dangerous than her usual fire. She took her place at the podium, adjusted the microphone, and for a moment let the room quiet itself. Her notes lay in front of her, but her eyes stayed on the chamber. When she began, her voice was steady, deliberate. She spoke of the ruling that had stripped away vital oversight of the communities now left vulnerable, of the erosion of trust in a system meant to protect the rights of all citizens. The words gathered pace, her cadence rising like a tide, pulling the room into her current. She painted the picture not in abstractions, but in the faces and stories of the people she represented. A mother turned away at the polls after decades of voting. A student told her registration had vanished. An elderly veteran forced to travel miles to reach the nearest voting station after his own was closed. Then her tone shifted. She stepped away from the safe language of policy debate and into the narrow, dangerous space where names live. Too often, she said, we speak as though injustice is a faceless thing, as though the machinery runs itself. But machinery is built and it is operated by people. And when those people are entrusted with the highest authority in our land, the weight of their choices must be carried in the open. She took a breath, the room holding with her, and then she said it. Chief Justice John Roberts. The syllables landed with the precision of a gavel strike. For a moment there was only silence. The kind of silence that seems to press in on the walls, holding every breath in the chamber. Then in the galleries above, there was a faint murmur, quickly hushed. On the floor, some colleagues stared openly, others dropped their eyes to their papers, as though avoiding the sight might keep them clear of its consequences. A few leaned toward each other in hurried whispers. She kept going, her voice cutting through the tension. She spoke of the meetings hidden from public view of the donors, whose interests aligned perfectly with the court's recent decisions of the deep and deliberate strategy to tilt the scales while the nation slept. By the time she finished, her pulse was steady, but her hands were tight on the edges of the podium. She stepped back, letting the words hang in the air. There would be consequences for naming him directly for breaking the unspoken rule that shielded the judiciary from such direct accusation on the floor. But she had done it knowing that silence would make her complicit. She gathered her notes, turned, and walked out under the gaze of colleagues who were still deciding whether to call it bravery or recklessness. Outside the chamber, staffers were already shoving phones in front of her, showing the flood of clips spreading across social media. One feed replayed the moment she spoke his name, the video already captioned and shared thousands of times. Comment threads burned with debate, some calling her a hero, others accusing her of undermining the court. None of it surprised her. She had not spoken for their approval. She had spoken because the truth had to be said where the country could hear it. If you were standing where she stood with the power to speak a name that could shake the foundations of an institution, would you call it out for the nation to hear? Or would you play by the rules and keep it hidden? The speech had barely cooled in the air before the counterattack began. By the next morning, conservative talk shows led their segments with her name framed in bold red banners, voices dripping with outrage as they accused her of disrespecting the Supreme Court and destabilizing the country. Clips of her floor speech were cut and spliced, her words rearranged to sound reckless, even unhinged. On one channel, a commentator leaned forward in his chair, warning that Jasmine Crockett was a dangerous radical with a personal vendetta. On another, a panel of pundits smirked over grainy photos, taken out of context, spinning harmless moments into signs of corruption. The ads followed just as quickly. 30-second spots flooded online feeds, narrated in ominous tones over black and white images of her face. They spoke of chaos, of extremism, of threats to the values of ordinary Americans. Social media accounts sprang up overnight, pumping out manipulated videos and false quotes. A clip from her interview where she had said, "This is not just policy," was edited to cut off the rest of her sentence, making it sound like an admission of partisanship. The hashtags spread faster than the truth could catch them. Inside her office, the atmosphere tightened. Her communications director closed the blinds during meetings, as though shielding the room from the noise outside. One aide urged her to issue a clarifying statement, something to soften the blow and shift the headlines. Another suggested stepping back from interviews for a few weeks, letting the storm pass. Jasmine listened, hands folded, eyes steady. She knew the risks better than anyone in the room. She also knew that retreating now would not just silence her, it would confirm the story her opponents were trying to write. The calls from allies were mixed. A few sent quiet messages of support, acknowledging her courage but cautioning her about the dangers of going head-to-head with Roberts. Others kept their distance, unwilling to be seen as siding with her. The political machine was doing exactly what it had been built to do: isolate the challenger, grind down their credibility, and make the fight too costly to continue. But Jasmine was not built for quiet exits. She walked to the window, pulling the blinds back just enough to see the dome of the Capitol glowing in the afternoon light. Somewhere inside, the same conversations were happening, the same whispers about how far she would go and whether she would survive it. She thought of the folder still locked in her desk, the pages that told a story the public had not yet heard. That truth was worth more than her comfort, worth more than her standing with colleagues who measured courage by its safety. She turned back to her staff, her voice calm but final. "We are not stepping back. If they want to fight, they are going to have it in the open." In the silence that followed, the hum of the city outside felt sharper, the air in the room heavier. The storm had shifted, and now it was coming straight for her. The pushback was still raging when her assistant stepped into the office holding out a handwritten note on plain stationery. No letterhead, no signature, just a number scrawled in black ink and 2 words: "Call tonight." She almost tossed it aside, thinking it was another crank message, but something in the deliberate hand caught her attention. At 9 that evening, with the blinds drawn and the hum of the city muted, she dialed. A voice answered on the first ring low and measured, carrying the weight of years in courtrooms. The man introduced himself as Samuel Harrington, a name Jasmine knew from headlines years ago. He had fought landmark civil rights cases in the 70s and 80s, the kind of lawyer who had stared down governors and sheriffs and still walked out with a verdict in his favor. He told her he had been watching the fallout from her speech and that he admired her refusal to step back. Then his tone shifted, growing sharper. He said he had something she needed to see, something that could turn her fight from a battle of words into a reckoning. They met the next morning in a small law office above a shuttered bookstore 3 blocks from the Capitol. The room smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Harrington was waiting at a desk cleared of everything but a thick, sealed envelope. His hands rested on it like it was a piece of evidence too dangerous to leave unattended. He told her it had come to him through a chain of trust he would not name from people who had spent years trying to track the quiet corridors where power and money met in the dark. He said the documents inside had never been made public, never been seen outside a small circle of attorneys who understood exactly what they were holding. Jasmine reached for the envelope, feeling the weight of it heavier than its size suggested. Harrington watched her without speaking. He said it contained minutes from private judicial conferences, internal memos that linked recent rulings to off-the-record meetings with a network of political donors and lobbyists. The names were ones she might recognize, but the connections, if she could prove them, would show a structure far larger than Roberts himself. It was not just about one man's decisions. It was about a network that had learned to bend the highest court without ever leaving fingerprints. She did not open it there. Instead, she slipped it into her bag, her fingers tightening around the leather strap. Harrington told her to read it alone in a place she trusted, and to understand that once she did, she could not unsee it. His voice was steady, but there was a glint in his eyes that told her he had carried this weight for a long time. As she stepped back out into the street, the traffic roared in her ears, the cold air biting against her skin. The envelope felt like a live current against her side, humming with the possibility of what it might contain. Somewhere inside those sealed pages could be the thread that, if pulled, would unravel more than she had ever imagined. She waited until the apartment was silent before she unlatched the window and let the night air settle in. The envelope lay on her dining table like an object that did not belong in the ordinary world, its seal unbroken, its weight heavier than any paper should be. Jasmine sat down slowly, the streetlights casting long shadows across the wood. She slid her thumb under the flap and opened it with a single motion. The documents inside were thick, the kind that carried the scent of toner, and time the edges faintly curled from being handled in secrecy. The first sheet was a map. At first glance, it was a familiar outline of a southern state, but when she leaned closer, she saw the annotations. Thick red circles around districts with majority Black and Latino populations. Handwritten notes in the margins marked polling stations slated for closure, entire neighborhoods flagged for ID law changes. The dates in the corner match months before the last election, the changes all timed to roll out quietly during the off-season, when no one would be watching. Beneath the map, in careful penmanship, was a single line. These are the key leverage points. She turned the page and found a series of emails, heavily redacted, but still damning. Sent from addresses she recognized as connected to state election boards, they carried subject lines like turnout, risk assessment, and security integrity measures. Between the black bars of redaction were enough words to form a pattern. The phrasing was deliberate coded, but the intent was unmistakable. They were discussing how to minimize turnout in those circled districts, framing it as safeguarding the vote while ensuring fewer of those votes were cast. One email chain caught her attention. It mentioned a private briefing attended by legal advisors tied directly to the Supreme Court's administrative offices. The participants were listed by initials only, but one set of initials was impossible to miss. JGR. The chain ended with a brief note from a donor liaison, thanking the recipients for their continued commitment to preserving the balance. The balance. She could hear the cold precision of the phrase in her mind. It was the kind of language designed to sound harmless in public and decisive in private. Another document detailed a meeting schedule eerily similar to the one she had already seen in the leaked folder. This time the locations were cross-referenced with the maps. The overlap was exact. Meetings in districts marked for polling site closures. Dinners held days before legislative sessions that introduced new voting restrictions. Conferences scheduled in the same week as court decisions that upheld those restrictions. It was a blueprint for reshaping the electorate without ever passing a law in Congress. She kept reading her pen, scratching notes into the margins of a legal pad. Each connection tightened the net, each page made the picture clearer. This was not a scattered set of coincidences. It was a coordinated operation stretching from state houses to the highest bench in the country, designed to control who had a voice in the nation's future. The more she read, the more she felt the quiet burn in her chest. She thought of the families in her district who worked double shifts just to keep the lights on, who now might face hours-long waits at a single polling station because the one near their home had been shut down. She thought of the young voters who had told her they were ready to make change, only to find their registrations purged without explanation. By the time she reached the last page, the city outside had gone quiet. The clock on her wall ticked past midnight, but she did not move. The final document was a memo outlining talking points for public defense of the restrictions. The language was clean, almost lyrical, crafted to frame every change as a necessary step toward fairness. But in the margin in handwriting she had now seen twice was a note. Optics are crucial. Avoid legal exposure. Keep judiciary shield intact. She stared at it, her eyes tracing the shape of each letter, and felt the line between suspicion and certainty vanish. She stacked the pages, carefully sliding them back into the envelope. Her hands were steady now, her mind already moving ahead. These were not just files to be read. They were evidence to be used. The stakes were no longer abstract, no longer something that could be debated in the safe distance of theory. The battle lines were drawn on maps and in inboxes, and she had just seen the coordinates. The question now was not whether she would act, but how far she was willing to go once she stepped into the light. The first call came just after 2 in the morning. Jasmine's phone lit up on the nightstand, the number hidden behind a string of zeros. She let it ring out, assuming it was another wrong number, but 30 seconds later, it came again. This time she answered, her voice low and guarded. There was no greeting, no introduction, only the faint sound of someone breathing on the other end. Then a voice, distorted and unsteady, said 5 words before the line went dead. You don't know who you're fighting. By dawn, 2 more calls had come through, each from a different block number. She deleted the voicemails without listening, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But that evening, as she was reviewing her notes at the kitchen table, a slow, deliberate knock sounded at her door. Not the quick rap of a neighbor, not the hurried tap of a delivery driver. 3 knocks spaced evenly apart, as if each one was meant to be heard and remembered. She stood still, listening. When she finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. Only the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the air. She told herself it was nothing, just the shadows playing games in her head. But the next day, her mother's voice came through her voicemail, fragile with worry. Please, baby, just be safe. I saw the news. I heard what you said. People like him, they don't forget. The words landed harder than she expected, carrying with them the weight of a truth her mother had learned long before she had stepped into public office. Jasmine listened twice before deleting it, her thumb hesitating over the screen. Her staff noticed the change in her routine almost immediately. She arrived earlier, left later, her eyes scanning the street before stepping into the building. The head of her security detail suggested doubling their presence, adding plainclothes officers to shadow her when she was off the clock. She agreed, though she hated the idea of moving through her own life with a wall of eyes around her. At night, she began checking the locks twice, drawing the blinds before the streetlights flickered on. The quiet comfort of her home had shifted into something watchful, the air heavier, as though it carried the gaze of strangers. Still, she did not stop. The folder of documents remained on her desk, the pages spread out in careful order, each one a piece of the picture she could not ignore. Every threat only sharpened her focus. If they were trying to frighten her into silence, it meant she was close enough to matter. It meant the story inside that envelope was more dangerous than she had guessed. Her mind went back to the annotated maps, the red circles over neighborhoods she knew by name, the handwritten notes in the margins that revealed just enough to connect the dots. One night, while reviewing her speech drafts, she caught her reflection in the darkened window. Her expression was steady, but her eyes carried a quiet edge she recognized from photographs of herself on the house floor. It was the look of someone who had chosen the harder road and knew there was no turning back. The calls, the knocks, the whispers in her mother's voice, they were warnings but also confirmation. She was walking exactly where they did not want her to go. The city outside kept moving indifferent to the quiet war playing out in the spaces between public appearances. In those spaces, Jasmine had begun to understand the cost of carrying the truth. Yet the thought that pressed in hardest was not fear for herself, but for the people who had no security detail, no cameras, no podium from which to speak. If she stepped back now, their voices would vanish into the same silence that had kept this machine running for years, and that she knew was a cost she would never be willing to pay. The decision to go public came quietly without a meeting or a formal announcement. Jasmine was sitting in her office before sunrise, the envelope open beside her, when the choice settled in. The threats had made it clear there was no safe way forward. Silence would only serve the people who had built this network in the dark. She called a journalist she trusted, one who had built a reputation for holding power to account, and asked a single question. Are you ready to see something the country was never meant to see? By the next evening, the studio lights were hot on her face. The cameras were close enough for the audience to see the sharp edges of her expression, but not the steady pulse in her wrist. She spoke plainly, beginning with the ruling that had stripped oversight from voting rights enforcement. Then she reached for a folder on the desk between her and the host, sliding out a single sheet of paper. It was an annotated map from the sealed documents, red circles over minority-heavy districts, the handwritten note about leverage points still visible. She turned it toward the camera, letting the lens hold on the image just long enough for the viewers at home to take it in. The host's eyes widened slightly, but they did not interrupt. Jasmine explained where the map had come from, how it aligned with polling station closures and legislative sessions, how it was connected to a series of meetings attended by high-level judicial figures. She did not show the emails, not yet, but she described them in measured detail enough to make the audience understand this was not speculation. The silence between her sentences felt louder than her voice, the studio thick with the sense that a line had been crossed. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. News networks replayed it on a loop. Social media feeds were saturated with still frames of the map. Hashtags lit up, some praising her courage, others questioning her motives. The attention was immediate and ferocious. That night, Robert stepped in front of cameras for a rare press conference. His words were calm, but precise, each syllable measured. He called her claims dangerous lies, the kind of rhetoric that undermined public trust in the judiciary. He denied attending any meeting that compromised his role and framed her leak as a political stunt designed to erode the legitimacy of the court. Standing behind the podium, his face betrayed nothing, but Jasmine watched the footage later and noticed the way his jaw tightened when the questions turned sharper. Reporters pressed him about the donors, the locations, the timing of certain rulings. He sidestepped with the practiced ease of someone who had been answering questions his entire career without ever revealing more than he wanted to. Back in her office, Jasmine replayed both her interview and his response side by side. The contrast was stark. She had shown a piece of the truth. He had called it a fabrication. The public was now caught between two versions of reality, and she knew the fight would not be won with one map or one broadcast. It would take every piece of the puzzle revealed in a way that no denial could erase. She closed the laptop, her resolve sharper than it had been that morning. The line had been drawn in front of the whole country, and there was no stepping back from it now. They built the set inside a cavernous soundstage that had once hosted variety shows and holiday specials, but tonight it felt like a chamber where the country would hold its breath. The floor was polished to a dark sheen, reflecting light in narrow bands that carved the space into lanes of authority. At the center, a raised bench echoed the silhouette of a judicial dais, towering without being ostentatious, a reminder that power often relies on height and angle. Every line pointed the eye toward the two opposing tables, council pads aligned with military precision. Rows of audience seating curved in a shallow horseshoe around the stage, elevated just enough to suggest oversight rather than spectatorship. Seat backs were engraved with small brass numbers, as if each person had been summoned rather than invited. Along the edge of the horseshoe ran a recessed rail of embedded screens ready to display evidence, timelines, and results with clinical clarity. Above them, a halo of cameras waited on silent gimbals, their lenses steady as sentries. The lighting design was calibrated like a heartbeat. A soft wash fell over the audience so that faces could be read, reactions weighed, while cooler pools of light gave the stage the crisp geometry of a courtroom sketch. A strip of LEDs traced the base of the bench, and the opposing tables a subtle pulse set to rise in intensity during testimony. The director called it the tide. The crew called it the tell. Behind the bench sat the host, not robed, but dressed in austere lines that conveyed neutrality without costume. Their desk held a narrow stack of cards and a discrete screen where producers could push verified prompts in real time. To the left, a witness chair sat on a low platform, flanked by two side panels that could transform into screens for documents or map overlays. The fabric of the chair was a dense gray, the color of deliberation. The audience had been screened for security and balance, but they were more than bodies filling seats. Each held a vibration pad the size of a coaster that would register sentiment in between applause lines, feeding a heat map to the control room. They were the jury in name and in function. Their final vote would be cast through a secured app tied to those numbered seats, time-stamped and locked to the show archives. In the control room, walls of monitors bloomed with test patterns and holding shots. A clock in the corner counted down in red numerals that seemed to tick louder as they neared the hour. Producers moved in the choreography of a launch, headsets pressed to their temples, voices even. One screen held the composite of social feeds. For 3 days, the Tag People's verdict had topped the national conversation, spawning think pieces, dueling op-eds, and 1,000 breathless threads. Jasmine arrived by a service corridor that smelled faintly of paint and metal, the quiet industrial lungs of the studio. The security team flanked her, their footfalls softened by runner mats. She paused at the threshold before stepping into the penumbra of the set eyes adjusting to the calculated glow. The raised bench and the witness chair resolved into tangible shapes rather than symbols. This was not a court, not by law, but it was built to feel like the place where truth could not hide. A stage manager clipped a small transmitter to the back of her jacket and adjusted the mic at her collar. He did not make small talk. He told her where to stand for the first shot, where the camera would find her, how the light would tilt when the host spoke her name. Jasmine nodded, listening but not storing, because the real map was in her head. Evidence here, witness there, an arc that would unfold without theatrics because the documents were heavy enough on their own. Screens blinked to life as the team ran final tests. A state map appeared, black background districts outlined in pale silver. A touch brought up the red circles she knew too well, then the timestamps that matched legislative calendars down to the hour. Another screen cued the redacted emails, lines of black gauze laid across sentences, while the surviving words formed a pattern anyone could read. The graphics were clean, ruthless in their restraint. A runner slipped a tablet into the host's hand and murmured the latest numbers. Across the country, bars were setting the show on corner screens between playoff games. Living rooms had invited friends over under the pretense of company, but it was suspense they were hosting. At campuses and union halls, projectors were pointed at cinderblock walls. People's verdict had become more than a tag. It was a promise of a reckoning, even if no gavel would fall. On the far side of the stage, the opposing table waited. A narrow stack of folders sat center, identical to the ones in Jasmine's office, their edges aligned so sharply they gave the impression of blades. A single glass of water stood to the right, beads gathering as slowly as a clock. An empty chair was slid back an inch, as though its occupant had already risen to object. The sound team brought the room to a hush, with nothing more than a dim of the ambient track, the auditory equivalent of a finger pressed to lips. The audience settled shoulders, squared eyes forward. In the control room, the director lifted a hand, and the camera halo pivoted in a slow, silent arc. A tone swept through the headsets. It was time. Jasmine rested her palm on the edge of the table and felt the slight give of the wood under the finish. She pictured the map, the circles, the dates, like coordinates punched into a compass. Somewhere beyond the studio walls, a press office had already drafted a statement, and somewhere farther still, phones were being picked up in houses where power does not sleep. The stage had been constructed to resemble a chamber, but what would happen here would not be theater. The host looked up, catching her eye for half a breath, a handshake without touch. Then the first red light bloomed on a camera, and the screens along the jury rail shifted from holding blue to live, feed the image of her table and that empty chair framed together. Across the country, living rooms leaned closer. In the control room, the social feed spiked. People's verdict rolled like a tide through timelines. The court that was not a court had come to order without a word spoken. The host set the tone with a measured welcome and then ceded the floor. Jasmine stood the studio lights skating across the polished table and called her first witness. A community organizer from the east side took the chair palms, flat voice steady from a lifetime of school gym microphones and town hall echoes. She described Election Day like a test that had been rewritten without notice. Polling sites shifted miles away. Buses rerouted the lines, a slow crawl that bled hope from daylight. Jasmine laid a map on the screen to her left, the same districts circled as if with a thread pulled tight. She asked where the closures hit hardest, and the witness pointed with a fingertip that did not tremble. The camera found faces in the audience, some nodding, some biting the inside of their lips. A graphic overlaid timestamps, and the room absorbed the pattern without the need for rhetoric. The second witness was a pastor whose church had long doubled as a polling place and pantry. He recounted how his congregants arrived to find a laminated sign that sent them across town, a detour for anyone with a car and a barrier for those without. He spoke of the old woman he drove himself, her hands folded around a purse that held a registration card and a photo of a son who pushed her wheelchair. Jasmine did not interrupt. She let the pauses carry weight. When the pastor stepped down, the lights cooled by a shade, and the host announced a former court staffer under conditions approved by legal counsel. The man entered with the careful posture of someone who has lived for years inside rules and schedules. He did not offer conclusions. He described calendars, travel logs, and the way private dinners were often denoted without location detail. He referred to initials only, and one set drew a murmur that died quickly on the rails of the studio's hush. Jasmine asked for clarification on a week where a ruling was finalized, and a private briefing occurred 2 days prior. The staffer did not speculate. He said the timing was unusual enough to be remarked upon by colleagues, and then he let the sentence end. On the screens, a simple 2-column timeline appeared, dates aligned with a line that did not waver. The camera cut to Jasmine's hands, resting open on the table, then to the staffer's gaze fixed somewhere neutral beyond the lens. Across the stage, Roberts leaned in slightly, a gesture that read as composed, until the close shot revealed the flex of his jaw. When the host invited his response, he rose with the economy of someone who understands how posture can be argument. He said the court does not bow to political pressure and that private dinners do not equate to impropriety. He framed the documents as partial and contextless, a collage assembled to indict rather than to inform. Jasmine returned to the evidence instead of his characterization. She brought up the redacted emails, their surviving words forming a spine of intention. She did not ask him to explain away the handwriting in the margins. She asked him to speak to the principle that appeared again and again in the phrasing that balance so often invoked when access narrowed rather than broadened. The lens tightened on him in that moment, and the skin beside his temple drew taut before he smoothed it with a breath. A neighborhood advocate took the chair next, young, measured, and relentless with data. She cited turnout dips mapped to transportation deserts, then held up a stack of affidavits from voters whose registrations had been challenged in batches. The screen mirrored her numbers in clean lines, not a single color changed from the scheme set at the start. Roberts objected to drawing a line from state practices to the court's integrity, reminding the room that the judiciary interprets rather than designs. The host allowed the reminder to stand and then invited Jasmine to proceed. She asked the advocate one final question about the feeling in those lines when the sun sank and people had to leave to relieve a babysitter or to clock in at night shift. The advocate answered softly, and the room shifted in a way a meter could not display. For a beat, even the timeline on the screens looked like a pulse. When the final witness for the segment took the chair, a retired clerk with careful diction, the shape of the hour revealed itself. He spoke of language, how drafts migrate toward certain constructions when there is a destination in mind. He did not accuse. He observed. Jasmine thanked him and turned back toward Roberts, not to trap him, but to let the contrast sit between documents and denial. Roberts spoke again, more quickly now, his voice still even, but the words closer together. He warned against a world where courts are on trial in studios and where public confidence is traded for spectacle. The tight shot caught a swallow he could not time to a period. The host drew the segment to a pause, and the jury rail screens flickered with a prompt that did not show results yet. In the seconds before the break, the camera framed them both in the same rectangle, 2 tables separated by a polished aisle and a gulf of interpretation. The audience held still, devices in their palms, ready to register the shape of their belief. The control room clock moved by a single digit, and the nation leaned into a silence that felt like a held breath before a verdict no one had yet spoken. The hosts lifted their gaze from the desk cards and let the room settle into a measured hush. They spoke with the cadence of a judge reading instructions to a jury explaining that the next minutes would belong to the audience both inside the studio and across the country. The decision would not be a legal ruling, but a civic measure, a barometer of trust rendered in the simplest form possible. Your vote will decide the verdict for tonight, they said, every seat authenticated, every tally recorded, every result displayed in real time. A soft glow rose along the jury rail as tablets woke to a waiting screen, a single prompt poised to receive a choice. In the control room, the sentiment map came alive, counties and campuses pinging the network as watch parties synced their votes. The stage lights cooled by a breath, and in that blue, a graphic unfolded above the bench, a clean scale with two plates labeled credible and not credible. The director gave the quiet order to split screen, placing the evidence montage on one side and the faces of both tables on the other. Jasmine did not move. The camera found her in three-quarter profile, eyelids still hands open on the tabletop, as if she were offering the documents one more time without a word. On the opposing table, Roberts adjusted a lone sheet of paper he had not looked at in 10 minutes, the edge sliding a fraction until it aligned with the grain. The host recapped the standard of tonight's exercise, not proof beyond doubt, but the measure of faith the public was prepared to give or withhold once shown the pattern. A clock appeared in the corner of the main screen, white numerals against black set to count down from 60. The host asked the audience to vote only after a moment of stillness to let the evidence and the testimony sit in the mind without noise. A hush spread like a tide rolling over stone, gathering the small sounds until there was only breath and the faint electricity of the set. Somewhere far beyond the studio living rooms lifted remotes and phones as if they were the same instrument. The first votes began to land, a thread of numbers stitching along the lower third in increments too quick for the human eye to parse. The control room fed the aggregate into the scale graphic, and the left plate sank by a degree that no one mentioned on air. The hosts kept their gaze steady, the camera frame tight enough to read the corners of the mouth, but not the pulse in the throat. On the jury rail, a line of redacted text dissolved into the map overlay, and then into the timeline, each image passing like the memory of a fact just recalled. The clock ticked to 45, and the host gave each side a final sentence. Roberts spoke first, a clipped reminder that courts are not popularity contests and that faith must survive ridicule. The close-up caught the soft press of his lips at the end of the line, the smallest tell of strain. Jasmine answered with a single clause about doors that close when light is kept outside, and then she stopped, letting the camera drift from her face to the document spread that glowed like streetlights in rain. At 30 seconds, the studio felt smaller, the way a room shrinks when a long day is about to decide itself. The audience leaned in an instinct as old as deliberation. The host's voice narrowed to a thread as they reminded viewers at home that their votes were registered once locked and that the board would show the weight of the country's choice without commentary. The clock fell to 15, and the scale graphic trembled in a way that suggested the software was processing a surge. In the control room, a producer lifted a finger to time the final cutaway. The camera slid toward Roberts and held patient and unblinking as he forced his shoulders to remain level and his eyes to stay on the bench rather than the numbers creeping at the edge of his vision. The director called for a clean frame, and the lens eased tighter until the line of his jaw and the set of his mouth filled the screen with a human geometry of control. The clock hit 5, and the host promised the results on the other side of the break, the scale frozen exactly where it was for now. The image held for a breath longer than comfort allowed light washing the planes of his face, while the studio air seemed to stop moving. The tension was not a sound, but a weight, the kind that makes even the quietest room feel crowded. Then the picture locked into a still Roberts in half-profile jaw, squared eyes rimmed with effort. The numbers paused at the bottom of the frame like a tide just shy of shore. The country watched as the freeze frame settled and the screen cut to black. The return from black was a breath held too long. The scale graphic brightened and steadied. Then the numbers began to resolve in clean white type across the bottom band. For a heartbeat, the room sat inside silence. And then the figure clarified and stilled as if engraved. 92%. The word beneath it was a single syllable that carried the weight of a gavel without the sound. Guilty. The audience did not erupt so much as exhale a collective release that moved through shoulders and faces like weather. The host read the result with the careful cadence of a record, not a triumph, and the cameras drifted to the juror rail, where hands lowered phones in unison, as if they had all remembered that breathing required empty palms. Jasmine did not look toward Roberts. She kept her eyes on the evidence screens and then on the faces beyond them, as if the numbers themselves were less important than the people who had made them. The director cut wide and the set revealed its architecture, again a chamber designed to hold precisely this moment. Outside the studio, the first wave rose as clips of the reveal ricocheted across feeds. The still image of the scale at 92 became a banner for watch parties and comment threads. An old clip of Jasmine meeting voters outside a shuttered polling place surfaced and stitched itself to the present, drawing a line from sidewalks to soundstage. Editors lifted her line about doors that close in darkness and set it in stark type over the map of red circles, a pairing that moved from phones to billboards in the time it takes a trend to crest. Reporters began their stand-ups with the skyline behind them and the word verdict in their leads. Radio shows spliced the steady tone of the host with the soft intake of breath that followed, replaying it like a drumbeat under commentary. In neighborhoods where the circles on the map had once been dots on a page, people texted links across kitchen tables, and bus routes the video auto playing above grocery lists and shift schedules. The number did not solve a case and it did not bind a court, but it signaled something older than law. It said that a narrative had shifted in the daylight. Back in the green room, a producer handed Jasmine a phone that was already warm with notifications. Her name had begun to shear free of titles and joined single-word shorthand for the night. Clips of her sitting very still while the scale tipped had gathered millions of views in the space between segments, and a still frame of her hand resting open on the table had become a quiet emblem for the steadiness of refusal. She set the phone down and looked at the monitor that showed the wider country a braid of images from living rooms and school auditoriums and late-night diners. In the control room, the sentiment map cooled from a flare to a steady glow, and the director rode the line between analysis and pause, giving the nation a moment with the figure before any voice tried to own it. The show moved into its next beat, but the number stayed in the lower corner like a watermark. Outside street traffic sounded different, like the tempo of a city that knows it has seen something it will talk about in the morning. Jasmine adjusted the lapel mic she had forgotten she was wearing and let herself take one long breath. The verdict was not binding, but it bound a story to a direction, and it placed her name at the center of a map that now belonged as much to the audience as to the stage. The glow of the verdict had not faded before the machinery began to turn. By the next morning, formal ethics complaints were filed, their language sharp and deliberate, accusing Jasmine of undermining judicial integrity and weaponizing confidential material for personal gain. The documents arrived in neat envelopes on the desks of committee chairs, a signal that the move was as much about optics as process. Behind closed doors, party leadership began to receive calls laced with reminders of donor commitments and warnings about political fallout. The message was clear: distance yourselves from her, or you will carry the weight of her war. In the corridors of the Capitol, colleagues who had stopped to shake her hand only days before now offered curt nods or found reasons to glance away. Invitations to caucus strategy sessions were quietly withheld. A meeting she had requested on voting rights reform was postponed without a new date. It was an isolation both strategic and visible, designed to leave her standing alone under the full light of the controversy she had ignited. Online, the counterstrike moved faster. Anonymous channels began releasing slickly edited videos cut to the rhythm of attack ads, their thumbnails screaming with doctored images of her holding cash or standing in shadow beside headlines about corruption. One clip stitched together out-of-context moments from speeches and interviews, laying a false trail toward a fabricated scandal. Another used artificial voice replication to make it sound as if she had admitted to manipulating evidence. Within hours, these videos climbed into the trending lists, some pulling millions of views before fact-checkers could catch them. The comment section split along sharp lines, half defending her with links to the broadcast, half repeating the phrases seeded by the smear. A swarm of new accounts appeared, posting identical criticisms across platforms, their timing too synchronized to be organic. In staff briefings, her communications team began tracking the IP clusters and timestamps, each data point another breadcrumb, pointing back to coordinated efforts. Still, the volume of disinformation was relentless, and the algorithm rewarded its momentum. Jasmine watched one of the most viral clips from her office. The audio warped just enough to carry a note of guilt she had never spoken. Her aide muted it halfway through, asking if they should push harder on rebuttals or let the outrage burn itself out. She shook her head, knowing that the smear was not built for truth. It was built for saturation, for repetition, until even those who did not believe it could not avoid hearing it. The pressure on her was not just digital. A senior figure in her own party called late in the evening, speaking in the slow, careful tone of someone delivering unwelcome advice. Step back for a few months, let the noise die down, focus on district work. She listened without interrupting, then ended the call with a thank you that held no agreement. The line between her and retreat had already been crossed, and she had no interest in walking it back. By week's end, the smear campaign had achieved its first goal. The narrative had shifted from the evidence she had shown to the question of her credibility. But underneath the static, her supporters kept sending messages, forwarding clips of the broadcasts, reminding her of the faces in the jury rail that night. The noise was meant to drown her out, but she understood the strategy too well. They were playing for exhaustion. She was playing for endurance. They chose fluorescent school gyms and church basements rather than televised stages rooms where the lights hummed and folding chairs creaked when people shifted their weight. Jasmine stood at the front with a single mic on a metal stand, no teleprompter, no graphics, only a battered corkboard with maps thumbtacked in rows. The first town hall felt like stepping into heavy weather, a mix of admiration and fear in the faces looking back at her. She began with the story everyone knew by now, and then moved to the pages no one had yet seen, tracing the decisions that had turned neighborhoods into obstacles. A grandmother in a floral dress raised her hand and asked whether the broadcast had changed anything that mattered, her voice, half challenge and half plea. Jasmine answered with specifics instead of comfort, pointing to precinct counts and closure notices, then to the forms on the side table that would put volunteers in the right place on the right days. The room quieted into focus rather than applause. When the question shifted from anger to logistics, the tone of the evening turned from spectacle to work. Words spread and the rooms grew. In a union hall that smelled faintly of coffee and oil, a line of custodians in reflective vests waited to speak one by one. A man with calloused hands said he had watched the verdict reveal on a cracked phone during a night shift and felt something unclench in his chest. A young teacher stepped forward with a list of students who had turned 18 and wanted to help register seniors at their school. The camera of a local station caught her smile, small and tired and absolutely certain. The montage that followed moved through the district like a pulse. A barber shop where the owner propped an old tablet in the window and replayed the segment at low volume while he cut hair. A corner store where a cashier slid a voter information card across the counter with change and whispered, "We have your back." A kitchen where a mother pressed a palm to Jasmine's forearm and said, "Thank you for saying our names out loud," then introduced her to a son preparing for his first election day. Each thank you landed like a stone in the pocket weight that steadied rather than dragged. Not everyone who came to the microphone agreed with her. A retired officer asked whether putting a justice on trial in a studio risked tearing something that could not be mended. Jasmine did not argue his premise. She spoke of oaths and of the quiet force of daylight, of how institutions survive not by silence, but by repair. He listened, nodded once, and left his name at the volunteer table on the way out. The cameras did not linger, but the room did. Late one evening, in a library auditorium with humming lights and a stack of folding chairs against the back wall, Jasmine closed her notes and looked out at a crowd that had not thinned. Her staff had asked again whether the schedule should ease, whether the threats in the smear meant a pause was wise. She shook her head and turned back to the room. "We keep going," she said, "because the map changes only when the people on it move together." The night ended with hands lifting clipboards and pens, and with the quiet sound of chairs sliding across the linoleum as the district carried its share of the weight forward. The weeks after the town halls saw her name on banners in cities she had never visited. Activists turned live stream clips into rallying calls, students organized teach-ins on campuses, and veterans marched in uniform down main streets, saying the fight for voting rights was part of the oath they once swore. Drone footage captured swelling crowds in multiple cities holding handmade signs and chanting for judicial reform. Some rallies stayed quiet and focused. Others thundered with drums and bullhorns, but all carried the same demand: transparency and accountability from the highest court. Jasmine moved between them when she could, speaking briefly, letting the energy build from the people rather than the podium. What had begun as her fight was now a banner others carried, and the movement no longer fit into the limits of her own schedule. Momentum met resistance in the slow grind of legislative chambers. Proposals were stalled in committee amendments, buried in unrelated bills. Media attention began to thin, headlines turning to other crises, and with that shift came a quiet erosion of urgency. Worse, not every voice in the growing crowds was there to build. Some pushed false agendas, fracturing trust in online forums filled with arguments about strategy. Jasmine felt the strain in her body, and her tone the days stacking into nights where exhaustion dulled her focus. One evening alone in her office, she admitted to herself that she could not carry the movement on sheer force of will, but she also knew that movements were never meant to rest on one set of shoulders. The turning point arrived in the form of a bipartisan bill that surprised even seasoned observers. A coalition of lawmakers from opposite sides of the aisle signed on to a measure strengthening voting rights protections and increasing oversight of state election laws. It was not perfect, but it was real, and it had a path forward. Jasmine prepared her remarks with care, aware that the speech might be the last chance to frame the bill as more than political compromise. On the House floor, she spoke without notes, telling stories of voters turned away, of districts erased by maps, of the simple dignity of casting a ballot. Her voice carried through the chamber and out into the public record, a reminder that law is written not just in statutes, but in the lives it touches. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment before the clerk resumed the roll call, the sound of names marking the slow advance of change. The clerk read the tally, and the chamber exhaled as if a sealed room had found a window. The bill passed by a margin so slim it felt like a thread drawn through a needle in a moving car, yet it held. Jasmine kept her gaze forward, absorbing the weight of names called and choices fixed to the record. Across town, cameras waited for a reaction from the bench. Roberts remained in his chair, composed in posture and diminished in aura, his public standing thinned by weeks of scrutiny and the clarity of the broadcast map. The law on paper did not erase the past, but it created guardrails where there had been ditches, and the country sensed the contour of a new road. She took the wind out of Washington and carried it like a lantern through union halls, school gyms, storefront churches, and library basements. In each place, she spoke of small actions that add up to a living defense, then stepped back so others could take the mic. A montage unfurled across the country, a line outside a county office where first-time voters filled clipboards, a farm stand where a registrar sat up beside crates of apples and handed out forms between cash sales, a barber turning his shop mirror into a bulletin board with precinct maps and early voting hours, a classroom where seniors paired with juniors to practice provisional ballot procedures the way teams run plays. Faces repeated across states not as extras in a story, but as authors in their own right. Jasmine listened more than she spoke, collecting the rhythm of local effort and stitching it into a fabric that could outlast a news cycle. At dusk, she stepped onto the Capitol stairs, the stone still holding the day's warmth. Reporters waited, but Jasmine looked past the microphones to the small circle of people who had gathered first. She spoke quietly, saying the fight did not belong to one person, that it belonged to everyone who showed up and kept showing up, and that the next pages were still unwritten. She left the steps without ceremony and moved into the crowd. A teenager handed her a flyer for a registration drive. A veteran offered a ride to the polls list. A teacher asked for more forms. She listened, took names past clipboards, and smiled in that tired way that means the work is real. By the time the lights came on along the avenue, she was walking block by block with neighbors who knew the streets better than any map. No music swelled, no banner dropped, just people deciding to return tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, until the story they wanted to live matched the one they were writing together. Justice does not come from a single speech or one defining moment, but from thousands of steady steps taken by ordinary people. When Jasmine chose to speak the truth and withstand the pressure, she reminded us that change begins with refusing to compromise in the face of wrongdoing, and it grows through communities that listen, act, and protect one another. Every voter registration form, every respectful conversation, every decision not to stay silent is a brick in building a stronger democracy. This week, what specific step will you take to make sure your voice is present in our shared life? Registering to vote, bringing someone with you to the polls, or hosting a small conversation in your neighborhood? What you've just heard isn't just a story, it's a mirror to power silence and the people who dare to speak. While this is a dramatized work of fiction, it's rooted in truths, the kind we feel witness and too often ignore. All public figures and references are used with care not to defame, but to challenge the systems we live under. Any resemblance beyond public life is purely coincidental. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a question, a sense of injustice, please like this video and subscribe to Mr. Oath Stories. Your support fuels more fearless storytelling. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay brave, and whatever happens, don't stop asking why. Hit the bell icon, the next truth might be the one you've been waiting for.